Hello and welcome to Criminal Justice Inspection Unpacked, the podcast of Criminal Justice Inspection Northern Ireland, where we explore issues and developments in the criminal justice system in Northern Ireland. I'm Meloney McVeigh and it's great to be back with you again. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at developments within the Probation Board for Northern Ireland since the last CJI inspection of the organisation in 2020. Joining me are CJI Chief Inspector Jaqui Durkin and Amanda Stewart, Chief Executive of the Probation Board for Northern Ireland, and they'll be sharing their thoughts. So let's get started. Jaqui, I'm going to come to you first of all. Maybe you can do a little bit of scene setting for us. The last inspection of Probation Board was looking at probation practice, and it did highlight a number of challenges for the organisation. Can you briefly tell us what the inspectors were finding at that time and what needed to happen?
Yes, thanks, Melanie. So in 2020, the Probation Practice Inspection Report was published and it made 11 recommendations to the Probation Board for Northern Ireland. And they were really focused around, as they usually are in a CJI inspection, around strategy and governance, delivery and outcomes. So we made 5 strategic recommendations and 6 operational recommendations. And the first of those were primarily for the Department of Justice to look at to the status of PBNI and the governance arrangements for it. So things like the legislation permitted a board of up to 18 members, and certainly as inspectors, we thought it would be worthwhile just looking at that, given the length of time that had occurred since the founding legislation. So other things that we found were around how PBNI staff manage the risk of harm, identify the risk of harm and what they do when they find it. More focus on the quality of work with service users. And I suppose really importantly, looking at the culture of the organisation, which we know is very hard to assess. But certainly a lot of feedback from staff about not feeling valued, about uncertainty, about what they were required to do. And so big challenges for the organisation to address, a lot of issues with trust that needed to be taken forward. And we know that you can never say that's done, but we certainly felt it was important to have recommendations around that for the board and for the senior team in PBNI.
So quite a challenge that was being set through this inspection report for the organisation.
Yeah, I remember this inspection report well because it was one of the first ones that I was involved in when I became Chief Inspector. And that's why I felt it was important that we followed up on that and to see how the organisation had grown and developed as it moved forward. And it certainly was very challenging. It was challenging for me as Chief Inspector to have some of those difficult conversations with the team at the time, because no one wants to hear, challenging findings and recommendations. They maybe don't recognise themselves or their organisation in those recommendations. So it was important that we explained the evidence base and how we felt it was important that the PBNI grip this inspection report and move forward with the recommendations.
That's maybe a good opportunity to turn to yourself, Amanda, because you were just coming into the organisation, newly appointed, soon after the report had been published. What were your thoughts about this piece of work that was sitting in your in tray at that time?
Melanie, I think for me, I had come in a few months after the inspection had been produced, and there was a real sense in the organisation around the need to do something about this. And I suppose in a sense, it was really then for me just to just bring the direction to the organisation, because what I got was a sense of wanting to do the practice better. There was a recognition that the culture wasn't right. When I did read it, I remember thinking this was about probation practice, and yet the bits that were really stark were around the culture. And I suppose in a sense, and in fairness to CJI, you can't separate the two out, because you can't deliver effective probation service unless your staff feel valued and supported. And that particularly when you're dealing with really complex individuals and public safety risks, they need to feel safe in their practice. And in a sense, that was really what jumped out at the page of me. To some extent, we needed to deal with the culture to be able to affect the practice. and the two really were intertwined. But initially, when I did read it, I thought, why was this called a probation practice inspection? Because actually the bits for me were more about culture. But in terms of that time, just reading it, it also probably just in the back of my mind and starting to have those initial conversations with staff at the outset, going out and about round teams, was really just, it probably provided me with that context to ask some of the right questions and really to get a sense of what I needed to do and what I needed to prioritise as chief executive. So in many ways, I welcomed it, and I suppose I would say it's much easier whenever you're not the person that received that. Do you know, to some extent, I was the person that came in and had the report, and the onus was then on me to deliver the recommendations and to make some of those changes. The pressure came on me around the follow-up inspection.
And that's something that we'll be looking at now. But those, in terms of those initial challenges, what was it a difficult report for staff, or was it more a difficult report, do you think, for senior management within the organisation?
I think it was probably more a difficult report for senior management in terms of what it said, but also I think staff felt a real sense of disappointment. And I say that largely because they are deeply committed to the work that we deliver information, and to some extent because it was making recommendations and to some extent some criticisms around that practice. There was a real sense of, as an organisation, we'd lost our way. And there was a bit of blame at the organisation in that, but there was also a sense among staff of what their responsibility to this was. I mean, in fairness, Jaqui touched on something really important there. And in many ways, for an inspection coming in, I think the biggest criticism of your senior team can be that the inspectors come in and tell you something you didn't know. And in many ways, I've often said, if you're bringing in an inspection, make sure that you know what they're going to be told or what they're going to find. And there's no point in trying to cover things up either. But I think that was probably the bit for the senior leadership team that they struggled with the most. They didn't recognise and they didn't see what really was happening within the organisation.
So taking that grip of the recommendations, what was the steps that you were taking then to start to act on that with your senior leadership team?
I suppose the steps I started to take were really, first of all, about culture. And that started, and it was really the start of a process that has continued, and that was about listening. I prioritised going out and meeting teams, and rather than getting into a fix-it mode and an action plan, and I did know there was an action plan that had been developed before I joined the organisation. It had gone to the Justice Committee in August, and it had said that all the recommendations were complete. So in many ways, I just set that aside and decided to go out and really talk to the staff. And I also met with a number of other senior leaders in the justice system and with some of our partners in the community and voluntary sector, just to get a sense from them as to where we were at as an organisation and what I needed to do. And just been mindful of the recommendations that were made, but just layering on top of that the real sort of honest conversations that I was able to have right across the organisation with the board. I mean, I think at one time Jaqui came and spoke to yourself really, and you did say to me, listen, you've got challenges, here's what they are, but no better person for it, you know, and that was the sense around just working some of that out myself and not being too dogmatic about it in terms of having a sort of very pedestrian formulaic civil service type approach to a set of recommendations.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jaqui, Amanda, that was the work that was going on in the back. What was it that inspectors did find when the follow-up review was carried out?
Yeah, I'll get into that in a second, but I think just pick up a point, you know, that Amanda said there. I think what I was really encouraged by when I saw Amanda come into the organisation was that visibility and listening to understand rather than listening to kind of explain away. And I think that was really refreshing. And it's really difficult to go into an organisation where you have some of the same people are there, but they might have changed roles, or there might be, you know, a sense of their perceived reality about what's going on in that organisation. And I think it's really important to say, absolutely, inspectors found a lot of really good work and good practice going on as well. And that's why the inspection recommendations were very much focused on improvement and better services and on outcomes for service users. So in terms of the follow-up review, I think at the outset it's important to say, and we have talked about this before, it's so refreshing to go into an organisation who provides you with a self-assessment that actually bears some resemblance to reality. Because time and time again, you'll find that there's not substance to what that self-assessment is about. So for inspectors to go in and be able to have mature conversations with senior leaders and say, right, well, this is how you've said you've moved this recommendation forward. What is your evidence base? You know, what's been done? But for leaders to recognise, yeah, we've done this, but there's more to be done. This is a continuum. It's not a kind of, you know, when will we ever be able to say, particularly with the culture of an organisation, well, yeah, we've achieved that, we've moved on. There's certainly steps you can take, and under Amanda's leadership, that's what happened. Action was taken, and we have now an assessment of, you know, some of the things that have happened that have been able to happen. Unfortunately, there hasn't been an opportunity to have legislation to kind of change that structure of the board and what that might look like in the future. But there certainly has been a lot of work done, particularly around training and development and recognising good risk management. And when you identify risk, what action do you take on foot of that? How do you reflect that in your practice? How have you recorded that? How have you shared that information where you can? So an awful lot of actions being taken to implement the recommendations and take them to a certain point, but with the maturity and knowledge that it's not done. There's more to do.
Would you be in agreement with that assessment, Amanda, in terms of the changes in the organisation?
I would. I mean, in many ways, I think Jackie's touched on something really important there. I'm not sure that we will ever get to a point where we'll say all of these recommendations are fully achieved. And I came to that conclusion in terms of doing the self-assessment, where I thought, when would you ever say that you have reached the point where you no longer need to look at what you're doing to reflect on your practice? Some of the recommendations, I think, probably needed a focus at that time, but actually the time changes, and really since 2020, the criminal justice system has changed, society's changed, the people we work with, and that's probably been the biggest challenge, has changed, particularly since COVID. The complexity, the mental health, the addiction issues, and that necessitates us to look continually at how we deliver the services. And that's why in many ways, I think, as an organisation, I'm not sure that I'd ever be coming back and saying to you, our job here's done, there's nothing else to see. I think if you come back, and even for the next inspection, you'll find things, and that's part of what an inspection and the value of an inspection, that is about somebody from the outside coming in with the intention to actually improve and develop the services. And when you see inspection like that, I mean, I'd say to staff, we have accountability up on our wall as one of our values. And I've often said to them, if you don't like accountability, you're in the wrong job, because the public service requires accountability. But also we do an incredibly important job in terms of public safety, and people and communities need to have trust and confidence in what we're doing. So it is really important that inspectors can come in and that you give an honest assessment of where you're at, because actually what you're trying to do ultimately collectively is make the justice system more effective to create safer communities. And when you see it through that lens, as opposed to taking something personally, then it's much easier to reflect where you're at as an organisation and just some of the changes and challenges that you have going forward.
And what about for staff? How have the changes impacted their day-to-day experience? Do you get a sense that it's better now than it was, that things are moving forward in the right way?
I mean, in fairness, I'm out and about with staff at the minute, and one of the things that I've reflected in the organisation to the board and to the senior team, because I give an update every month at SLT just around some of the engagements that I am having with staff. The thing that really strikes me is how open staff are to just opening my door and coming in and saying to me, what about, have you thought about this? Whereas they wouldn't come near me to start with, because there was a sense that the chief executive was in some way remote in the organisation and a bit distant. And no matter how many times I said I have an open door policy, nobody ever opened it. And I had to work really hard, and it does feel like 3 years is a long time and yet a short time. But I get a real sense when I go into teams now that staff are just so open to having conversations with me, to saying, listen, this is the issues and here's what you need to do. This would be really great if. And that is lovely to see, because that's what you want as a leader in an organisation, because a lot of the time the solutions to some of the perennial and complex issues, particularly within our world, lie with the practitioners. But I think importantly, and it goes back to what was probably found at the outset around that culture of fear and blame, what I have tried to do as a chief executive is to create a culture where staff can reflect and review their learning or their practice, to look at the learning, and probably more importantly, to feel safe in practice. Because in fairness, the people that we're working with are really complex and risky individuals, and it's so important that they feel safe. And that allows them to not only stay, but also whenever things don't go right, that they can put their hand up and say, as an organisation, to the organisation, as individuals, I get this wrong. And in many ways, that was my approach to the self-assessment. It wasn't about saying everything's wonderful here. It's about saying, do you know what? We could do this a bit better. We've lost focus on this. And actually staff hearing that creates that culture around continuous improvement and learning, which is really set from the top. And that's why the self-assessment was so important, in terms of just not saying our job's done.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's critical in terms of when you look at what the probation board do. And I know that you know your vision and your mantra is around changing lives, and yet that trusted relationship that you need to build, that your staff need to build with service users, has to apply in-house as well. If you don't feel that work is a safe space to say, not sure about this, or maybe we should try something else, building those respected and trusted relationships is the business that you're in. And I think too, given where we have all been in organisations and as leaders through the pandemic, out of the pandemic, thankfully, but we're all, have learnt lessons from that period and how we've had to behave as leaders and what we've had to do with our staff. So it's about looking forward. It is very much about, right, where do we go, and with the criminal justice system that has so many people in custody at the minute, some that are coming out and coming to you for services, and yet as a community we're looking to the PBNI to be part of that jigsaw of keeping us all safe and making sure that risk is identified and well managed. So I think it is important that we recognise the great work that your staff are doing, and we're grateful for it, because it is about keeping us safe in society, but it's also looking at the important part PBNI plays in that chain of informing sentencing, but also about alternatives when criminality is evolving. And we've seen, look at what has happened over the last couple of weeks. You look at the criminality in Northern Ireland and how, as a community, most of us had dreamt and thought we'd moved on as a community, and yet some of those offenders, when they're sentenced, and if they're looking potentially for community sentencing or supervision, you say, well, that's a different type of criminality, and it's constantly evolving.
In terms of, maybe this is a question for both of you in turn, how does probation maintain this positive momentum? And from your perspective, Jaqui, as well, what do you think there is in terms of learning for other organisations within the criminal justice system in terms of how probation has actually managed this particular inspection and the recommendations?
Well, I think what's refreshing is, and Amanda and I have talked about this before, is it's not just about the senior person, it's the whole of organisation approach, about everybody in that organisation very clear about the direction and purpose of what we're there to do and what we want to achieve. So while it is critical to have a visible and trusted leader, that filters down through every member of staff, I think, in an organisation. And I think and moving forward, it's maintaining that attitude and that sort of reflective practice to say, yes, as community changes, as society changes, as the criminal justice system changes, how do we need to flex to that? As an organisation, how do our leaders and our staffs need to skill up to respond to that?
Amanda, what would your thoughts be around that?
I think from my own perspective, probably just looking to the future. I think the challenges that we face within the criminal justice system are just probably the most significant that we've ever had. And I say that as one of the leaders in the system. And I suppose as I look into probation, it is about making sure that we don't become just looking at ourselves, because we're only one part of the jigsaw. The crime that happens in communities, and it's a wider socioeconomic issues that are causing crime. And I think probably going forward, the priority for me to be for the organisation to become much more upward and looking out at other partners. The criminal justice system is one part. There's also the other parts of the executive in terms of the Department of Health, housing, and importantly, local communities. I mean, one of the messages that I had when I came into the organisation is the people we work with live in local communities, and they are there whenever we're not there supervising them. And it's really important that we continue to build those relationships. And that was probably one of the challenges around COVID, whenever people sort of retract and go into their houses or into their homes and didn't come out again, or go into their organisations. That sort of looking outwards at where the solutions and the lie for the people that we work with.
Can I ask just how valuable has the follow-up review been for you in terms of getting a sense of your progress or the job that's still to be done?
With a self-assessment, probably was really effective. I mean, we had regular updates through SLT in terms of where we were at. I suppose one of the things that really struck me whenever I sat down with the group of staff, when we did put together a group of staff, and we brought in an external person as well to just give us a different perspective, to sit down and look at this as a self-assessment and make sure that it wasn't what I thought where we were at in the organisation or where the senior leadership team thought we were at, but it was actually that sort of everybody felt a sense of the progress that we made. So in many ways, it actually probably galvanised the staff towards making the improvements that still need to be made, and also just their acknowledgement of the progress that had been made to date. You know, because in a sense, there was a real sense we'd done so much, and yet actually at the end of it, when we looked, we were like, we've only achieved one of the strategic recommendations, you know, and two of the operational, you know, all this effort for what? But actually there wasn't that sense. There was a real sense of we've made so much progress, but yet there's so much more for us to do. And that was the bit, in many ways, that has probably given me a roadmap for the next 3 years. But importantly, and I think this was the real learning for me, I probably was taking at face value where we were at until I really sat down in that group and started to get underneath and lift the bonnet of some of those recommendations and start to ask really pokey questions. And there's nothing like inspectors coming in to make you want to do that. And I got a different answer sometimes. And I sort of joked in the organisation to say, I think at different times that they were referring to me by everything other than my first name, because I kept coming back and saying, I'm not sure about this. Can we look at it again? And we did ask for an extension for the self-assessment, because actually I found huge value in doing that. And I think the rest of senior leadership team did as well, because you could then start to see, are we really 100% sure that is delivering that recommendation? We get very, very focused on what we said the actions were against the recommendations. Whereas I wasn't interested in the action, I was looking at the recommendation and saying, have we achieved that recommendation? Forget about the action. The actions are achieved, but actually what is the recommendation saying? And that probably was the real learning curve, I think, for all of us, but also just getting in underneath the detail of it and spending time and drilling down. But we have, in many ways, I lifted one of the recommendations over the last couple of weeks around a programme of work that we needed to do, and thought, what did we actually say back to CJI here that we needed to do? And let's just put, a plan around doing that.
Jaqui, for you, does that sort of reinforce the benefits of the follow-up reviews that the organisation carries out?
I think absolutely. I am very clear about it. When we do follow-up reviews, it's as much about assurance, just as it is in inspections. It's about assurance. It's about saying to a wider audience other than those inspected organisations, here's what we found in this organisation, and here's some recommendations where we think they could look to practice, or they could look to their governance and how things might improve. And for me, it's very much being alongside and not looking for things to be critical about. Sometimes you have to be critical. Sometimes you have to spell it out and say, well, here's the evidence. This is what we found. This is what we think really needs to change quite quickly. But for other organisations with a healthy mindset of saying, yeah, as an organisation, we know the world has changed. Our world is changing. Budgets are tight. There's other things going on in the criminal justice system. But how are we going to move forward as an organisation, and what do we need to do to make sure we're successful and maxing out the resources that we have and still look into our reason for being and our vision about keeping people safe. And I think that's really important when we move forward over the next 3 to 5 years, because we are certainly changing as a community. And those issues around health and education and all the things that impact on people's lives who come into contact with the criminal justice system, aren't going to change at a rate of knots either. So it's how do you work together as an organisation, very focused on what quality services look like and keeping people safe.
I think on that note, that will bring to a close the conversation today, and thank you both very much for joining me today and taking part in this episode of Criminal Justice Inspection Unpacked. Once again, I hope you've enjoyed the discussion, and I look forward to having you with us again for our next episode, when we look at issues impacting the criminal justice system in Northern Ireland.